In the scorched valleys of Arizona Territory, where justice was measured in lead and mercy was a luxury few could afford, a young widow made a choice that would shake the foundations of a corrupt town. She offered bread to a dying man who had a price on his head, but what she didn't know was that by sheltering this outlaw, she would ignite a war that would see his brothers surround the sheriff's office the very next day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of red earth and twisted Joshua trees beneath a sky that seemed to have forgotten the color blue. Here, in this forsaken corner of the territory, the town of Copper Ridge clung to existence, like a tick on a dying dog. It wasn't much to look at, a collection of sun-bleached buildings, a saloon that reeked of stale whiskey and broken dreams, and a sheriff's office that served more as a fortress for corruption than a beacon of law. 3 miles outside town, where the land turned even more unforgiving, stood the Blackthorn Ranch. Once, it had been a thriving operation, with cattle grazing on what passed for grass in this harsh country. Now, it was little more than a monument to lost hope, tended by one woman whose stubbornness had become legendary among the few neighbors who remained. Margaret Maggie Blackthorn moved through her morning chores with the mechanical precision of someone who had long ago stopped expecting joy from life. At 28, she bore the weathered look of a woman who had faced the desert's cruelty head-on and refused to yield. Her auburn hair, once her pride, was now pulled back in a practical bun that had given up on softness. Her hands, calloused and strong, bore fresh cuts from mending fence wire that would break again before the week's end. The ranch had been her husband's dream. Samuel Blackthorn had seen potential where others saw only desolation. He'd spoken of building an empire in this wasteland, of proving that determination could triumph over nature's hostility. 3 years ago, that dream had died with him when his horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole, throwing him against the rocks that dotted the landscape like ancient headstones. Maggie should have sold out then, should have taken whatever pittance. The bank was willing to offer and fled to somewhere civilized, but Samuel was buried beneath the lone elm tree behind the house, and leaving felt like abandoning him all over again. So she stayed, fighting drought, creditors, and the gnawing loneliness that had become her only constant companion. The morning sun was already merciless, promising another day of blistering heat that would suck the moisture from everything it touched. Maggie's few remaining cattle clustered around the well, their ribs showing despite her efforts to keep them fed. The creek that had once provided water year-round had been dry for 18 months, leaving her dependent on the well that dropped deeper every season. She was hauling a bucket of precious water to the vegetable garden when she heard something that didn't belong in her world of silence and resignation. A voice, weak and strained, calling out from somewhere near the old barn. Maggie's first instinct was to grab the shotgun from the porch. Strangers meant trouble in this country, and a woman alone was seen by many as fair game. But something in that voice gave her pause. It wasn't the demanding tone of a claim jumper or the threatening growl of a bandit. It was the sound of someone in desperate need, someone hanging on to life by sheer will alone. Setting down the water bucket, Maggie retrieved her shotgun and approached the barn with careful steps. The structure, like everything else on the ranch, had seen better days. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and gaps between the boards let in slashes of morning light that cut through the dusty interior like golden knives. Inside, huddled against a pile of old feed sacks in the far corner, was a man in worse condition than her most pathetic steer. He was young, probably no more than 30, with dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. His clothes were torn and stained, with blood that looked both fresh and old. A crude bandage, likely torn from his own shirt, was wrapped around his left arm, but it was doing little to stem the crimson flow that painted the dirt beneath him. When he looked up at her, Maggie saw eyes the color of winter storms, grey and turbulent, holding depths that spoke of violence and pain. But there was something else there too, something that made her lower the shotgun slightly. Desperation, yes, but also a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he was making peace with dying in a stranger's barn. "Don't mean any harm, Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just needed somewhere to rest." Maggie kept the gun trained on him, but found herself studying his face more than his wounds. There was something about him that didn't fit the usual mold of the desperados who sometimes wandered through this country. His features were strong but refined, and despite the circumstances, there was a politeness in his manner that seemed genuine. "You're bleeding all over my barn," she said finally. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "I apologize for the mess." Against every instinct that had kept her alive in this hard country, Maggie found herself asking, "When did you last eat?" The question seemed to surprise him more than the barrel of a gun pointed at his chest. "Don't rightly remember," he admitted. She should have turned away then, should have told him to drag himself somewhere else to die. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to ride into town and tell Sheriff Caldwell that a wounded stranger was trespassing on her land. But Maggie had learned that the smart thing and the right thing weren't always the same. "Can you stand?" she asked. He tried, pushing himself up against the barn wall with his good arm, but his legs buckled before he made it halfway to his feet. Maggie cursed under her breath, not at him, but at the situation, at the choice she was about to make that would complicate her carefully ordered world of solitude and safety. Setting the shotgun aside, but keeping it within easy reach, she moved closer. Up close, she could see that his wounds were worse than she'd initially thought. The bandage on his arm was soaked through, and there were other injuries visible through the tears in his clothing. Someone had worked him over good before. He'd managed to escape, and from the look of things, he'd been running hard for quite some time. "I'm going to help you to the house," she said, "but if you try anything foolish, I've got a grave already dug out back that's just your size." He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "Yes, Ma'am." Getting him to the house proved to be more of a challenge than either of them anticipated. For all his injuries, the stranger was solidly built, and Maggie was strong for her size, but dead weight was dead weight. They made it perhaps 10 yards before both of them were breathing hard and swaying on their feet. "This isn't working," Maggie muttered. "I can make it," he insisted, though the pallor of his skin suggested otherwise. "Pride's a luxury you can't afford right now," she told him sharply. "Sit." He didn't argue, sinking down heavily on a wooden crate that had once held supplies for the ranch's busier days. Maggie hurried to the house and returned with a wheelbarrow that had seen better decades but still held together. Getting him into it required some creative maneuvering and more than a little cursing on both their parts, but eventually she was, wheeling him across the dusty yard like an oversized sack of grain. Inside the house, the air was marginally cooler thanks to the thick adobe walls Samuel had insisted on when they'd built the place. Maggie had him transferred to the old leather sofa that dominated the small living room, then set about gathering the supplies she'd need. Clean cloth, her sewing kit, the bottle of whiskey Samuel had been saving for a special occasion that never came, and the few medical supplies left over from his accident. "What's your name?" she asked as she began cutting away the ruined bandage on his arm. For a moment he didn't answer, and she wondered if he'd passed out. But then his eyes opened, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her momentarily self-conscious. "James," he said finally. "James Morrison." The name meant nothing to her, which was probably for the best. In this country, a man's past was often better left unexamined. Well, James Morrison, this is going to hurt. She wasn't lying. When she poured the whiskey over the wound, he bit down on his own fist to keep from crying out, his whole body going rigid with pain. But he didn't complain, didn't curse her for the necessary cruelty. When the worst of it was over, he simply said, "Thank you." The wound was deep but clean. A knife thrust, not a bullet. Someone had gotten in close enough to smell his breath, close enough to see the fear in his eyes. But James had survived, which said something about either his luck or his skill. Maggie worked in concentrated silence, stitching the torn flesh with the same careful attention she gave to mending a torn shirt. It wasn't her first time patching up a wound. Ranch life had taught her plenty about dealing with injuries, both to animals and people. But there was something different about this, something intimate and dangerous about tending to a stranger who might very well be a killer. "You should have left me in the barn," James said when she'd finished with the worst of it. "Probably," she agreed, not looking up from her work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most people would have. I'm not most people. He was quiet for a moment, studying her face as she cleaned and bound a gash on his forehead. "No," he said finally, "I don't think you are." By the time she'd finished tending to his visible wounds, the sun was high and the house had begun to heat up despite the thick walls. James had drifted in and out of consciousness several times, and Maggie was beginning to worry about infection, about fever, about the dozens of complications that could turn a survivable injury into a death sentence. She made him drink water, small sips at first, then larger ones when his body proved capable of keeping it down. She fed him broth from a chicken she'd killed the day before, spooning it between his cracked lips like she was tending to an injured foal. It was while she was preparing a more substantial meal that she heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast, coming up the road toward her ranch. James heard it too. His eyes snapped open, alert in a way that spoke of a man accustomed to danger. When he tried to sit up, Maggie pushed him back down. "Stay put," she ordered, moving to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see dust rising from the road. As the riders drew closer, she counted them, 6 men, all armed, all riding with the kind of purposeful urgency that meant business. "Friends of yours?" she asked James without turning from the window. "Depends on your definition of friends," he replied, his voice tight. The riders reined in just outside her gate, their horses stamping and snorting from the hard ride. Maggie's heart sank as she recognized the man leading them, Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, Sheriff Caldwell's right-hand man, and a piece of work if ever there was one. Brennan was the kind of man who enjoyed his authority a little too much, who saw his badge as license to take what he wanted. "Mrs. Blackthorn," Brennan called out, "we need to have a word with you." Maggie glanced back at James, who had managed to prop himself up on one elbow despite her orders to stay still. His face had gone pale again, but not from pain this time, from fear. "You need to hide me," he said urgently. "From them. Those are lawmen." James's laugh was bitter. "Those are wolves in lawmen's clothing. Please. They'll kill me if they find me here, and they'll kill you too for helping me." Something in his voice, in the naked desperation of his plea, made her decision. Without another word, Maggie helped him to his feet and half-carried him into her bedroom. There was a space under the bed, not much, but enough for a man if he didn't mind breathing dust. "Stay quiet," she whispered, "no matter what you hear." Then she was back in the living room, smoothing her skirts, checking her hair in the small mirror by the door. When Deputy Brennan knocked, a sharp, demanding sound that rattled the hinges, she made him wait long enough to establish that this was her house, her threshold, her rules. "Deputy Brennan," she said as she opened the door, voice neutral. "What?" Brings you out here so early? Brennan pushed past her without invitation, his boots tracking dust across her clean floor. The other men followed, spreading out through her small living room like they owned the place. Maggie kept her face carefully blank, even as anger flared in her chest at the violation. "We're tracking a dangerous fugitive," Brennan said, his small eyes darting around the room. "Cut down 2 of our boys during his escape, left them bleeding in the street like dogs." "I haven't seen anyone," Maggie said truthfully. She hadn't seen anyone cut down 2 deputies after all. "Man goes by the name of James Morrison," another deputy spoke up, consulting a crumpled wanted poster. "Dark hair, average height, probably. Wounded. There's a $500 reward for information leading to his capture." $500. In this economy, it was a fortune. Enough to save the ranch, to pay off her debts, to start over somewhere new. All she had to do was point toward her bedroom. "Like I said, I haven't seen anyone," she repeated. Brennan's eyes narrowed. He was a man who had built his reputation on reading people, on knowing when they were lying. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him that Margaret Blackthorn was hiding something. "Mind if we have a look around?" It wasn't really a question. "Yes, I do mind," Maggie said firmly. "This is my home, and you have no right." "We have every right," Brennan cut her off. "When it comes to catching killers, we have all the rights we need." The search was thorough, but not destructive. These men knew the value of staying on the right side of at least some of the law. They went through her kitchen, her small pantry, the tiny room that had been meant to be a nursery but had never been used. They even checked the cellar and the barn, but they didn't look under the bed. When they finished, Brennan stood in the center of her living room, frustration written across his weathered features. "You sure you haven't seen anything unusual? Any strangers passing through?" "I see very few people out here, Deputy," Maggie said, "strangers or otherwise." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, if you do see anything, anyone, you send word to town immediately. This Morrison character is dangerous, and we can't have him threatening innocent folks." "Of course." After they left, Maggie stood at the window watching their dust trail disappear toward town. Her hands were shaking, and she realized she'd been holding her breath for the better part of 10 minutes. "Are they gone?" James's voice came from the bedroom, muffled but audible. "Yes." She found him still wedged under the bed, covered in dust and looking like he was in considerable pain from the awkward position. Helping him out and back to the sofa took some effort, and by the time they were done, both of them were breathing hard. "Thank you," he said simply. "They said you killed 2 deputies." James was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his bandaged hands. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that Maggie couldn't quite read. "I defended myself," he said. "They came for me with guns drawn. No talk of surrender, no reading of charges, just bullets and bloodlust." "Why? What did you do?" Another pause, longer this time. "I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, something that certain people in this town would kill to keep quiet." "What kind of something?" James met her eyes directly. "The kind that could get us both killed just for talking about it." Maggie wanted to press for details, wanted to understand what she'd gotten herself into, but something in his expression warned her off. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, too toxic to speak aloud. Instead, she said, "Are you hungry?" By evening, color had returned to James's face, and he was able to sit up without swaying. Maggie had fed him properly, beans and salt. Pork, bread, she'd baked herself, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He ate with the methodical efficiency of a man who had known hunger and wasn't taking sustenance for granted. They talked little during the meal, but it was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one. When full darkness fell, Maggie lit an oil lamp and settled into her chair with some mending while James dozed on the sofa. It was past midnight when the sound of horses woke them both. This time, there were more of them. Many more. Through the window, Maggie could see torches moving in the darkness, bobbing like malevolent fireflies as the riders spread out around her property. "How many?" James asked, suddenly alert despite having been deeply asleep moments before. Maggie peered out, counting carefully. 20, maybe 25. "They're not here for a friendly visit." A voice boomed out over the night air, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "This is Sheriff Caldwell. We know Morrison is in there. Send him out and no one else gets hurt." James struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but determined. "I have to go. I won't let them hurt you for my sake." "Sit down," Maggie ordered. "Mrs. Blackthorn, I said sit down." Her voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "This is still my ranch, and I make the decisions here." She moved through the house quickly, blowing out the lamp, checking the locks on the doors and shutters. The house had been built with defense in mind. Samuel had been a cautious man who understood the realities of frontier life. The walls were thick, the windows small and high, and there were firing positions built into the structure that most folks would never notice. "What are you doing?" James asked. "Getting ready for a siege." Maggie retrieved the shotgun from its place by the door, then opened a wooden chest that had remained locked since Samuel's death. Inside were weapons, rifles, pistols, and boxes of ammunition, enough to outfit a small army. "You can't fight them all," James protested. "Watch me." She handed him a Winchester rifle, noting how naturally his hands found the familiar grip. Whatever else James Morrison might be, he was no stranger to firearms. Outside, Sheriff Caldwell was growing impatient. "I'm going to count to 10, Blackthorn. Then we're coming in." Instead of calling back, Maggie opened one of the small windows that faced the yard and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed across the desert like thunder, and the horses outside whinnied and danced nervously. "The only thing coming in here uninvited are bullets," she shouted. For a moment, there was silence. Then Caldwell's voice again, angrier. "Now, you're harboring a fugitive, woman. That makes you an outlaw, too. Then I guess we're all outlaws tonight." The first shot came from somewhere near the barn, a rifle crack that sent a bullet whistling through the night air to thud into the window frame inches from where Maggie crouched. She answered immediately, sighting carefully and putting a round, close enough to the muzzle flash to send someone scrambling for better cover, and then all hell broke loose. The night erupted in gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning. Bullets hammered into the thick walls, shattered what few. Windows were exposed and whined overhead like angry wasps. Maggie and James moved from position to position, returning fire whenever they had a target, always keeping low, always moving. The thick adobe walls proved their worth, absorbing shot after shot without giving way. Samuel's design was working, exactly as he'd intended. The house was a fortress, and two people with enough ammunition could hold off a small army from inside. But it couldn't last forever. "They'll try to burn us out," James called over the gunfire. As if summoned by his words, a flaming arrow arced through the darkness and thudded into the wooden shutter of one window. Maggie was there immediately, beating out the flames with a damp cloth before they could catch. Another arrow, then another. The attackers were getting more creative, more desperate. Sheriff Caldwell had clearly expected this to be quick and easy. Ride in, overwhelm an isolated woman, take his prisoner. He hadn't counted on resistance, and certainly not the kind of determined, well-armed resistance they were encountering. "How much ammunition do you have?" James asked during a brief lull. "Enough," Maggie replied grimly. She didn't mention that enough was a relative term, and they were burning through it faster than she'd like. Dawn was still hours away, and already she could see that some of the attackers were trying to work their way closer to the house under cover of darkness. Soon, they'd be too close to miss, and all the thick walls in the world wouldn't help if Armed men were shooting through the doors and windows at point-blank range. "There's something you should know," James said quietly, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. "What's that?" "I'm not alone in this country." Before Maggie could ask what he meant, a new sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats again, but these were different, coming not from the direction of town, but from the open desert, and there were many of them. The shooting faltered, then stopped entirely as everyone, attackers and defenders alike, tried to identify the new arrivals. Through the broken shutter, Maggie could see Sheriff Caldwell's men turning, raising weapons toward this new threat. Then the horizon erupted in muzzle flashes. The new arrivals hit Caldwell's force like a thunderbolt, striking from the darkness, with the precision of a well-coordinated cavalry charge. But these weren't cavalry, they were something else entirely. Men who rode like they'd been born in the saddle, who fought with a savage efficiency that spoke of years spent in violent conflict. "Who are they?" Maggie asked. James smiled for the first time since she'd found him, and it transformed his entire face. "My brothers!" The battle outside shifted dramatically. Caught between the entrenched defenders in the house and the mounted attackers in their rear, Caldwell's force began to crumble. Men shouted contradictory orders, horses reared and bolted, and the organized assault devolved into chaos. Through it all, the newcomers pressed their attack with ruthless precision. They knew exactly what they were doing, exactly how to use the darkness and confusion to their advantage. This wasn't their first fight, and it probably wouldn't be their last. Within minutes, it was over. The survivors of Caldwell's force were fleeing into the desert, leaving behind dead horses, dropped weapons, and at least 3 men who weren't. Getting up again, the yard fell silent except for the snorting of horses and the distant sound of retreat. A voice called out from the darkness, speaking just loud enough to be heard in the house. "James! You in there, brother?" James moved, carefully to the window, rifle ready but not aimed. "I'm here, Marcus. You hurt? I'll live. Good! We got some cleaning up to do out here. Then we'll be in to talk." Maggie slumped against the wall, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight was draining away, leaving her shaky and queasy. She looked around. At her home, bullet holes in the walls, broken furniture, glass and debris scattered across the floor. But she was alive, and James was alive, and somehow that felt like victory. "So," she said weakly, "brothers?" James managed another smile. "The Morrison gang at your service." Gang. The word settled heavily between them. Maggie had opened her door to a wounded man, had fed him, and tended his wounds and defended him with her life. Now she was learning that she'd done all of that for an outlaw who ran with one of the most notorious gangs in the territory. "Are you afraid?" James asked quietly. Maggie considered the question seriously. Was she afraid? Of course, but fear and regret weren't necessarily the same thing. "Ask me tomorrow," she said finally. Outside, she could hear men working, dragging bodies, gathering weapons, tending to horses. The Morrison gang was cleaning up the battlefield with the same efficiency they'd shown in creating it. Soon, they'd be coming inside, and Maggie would learn exactly what kind of people she'd thrown her lot in with. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of violence, she sat with James Morrison in her bullet-riddled living room and tried to come to terms with how drastically her life had changed in the space of a single day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new consequences. Tomorrow she'd have to face whatever came next. Tonight she was alive, and that was enough. Dawn broke over the battlefield, painting the desert sand crimson where blood had mixed with dust. Maggie emerged from her battered home to find 6 rough men waiting in her yard, their leader a grizzled veteran with silver threading his dark hair. Marcus Morrison stepped forward, hat in hand, more gentleman than outlaw. "Ma'am, I owe you a debt I can't repay," he said simply. You saved my brother's life." The gang spent 3 days rebuilding what the siege had destroyed. They worked without complaint, transforming the ranch into something stronger than before. On the 4th morning, James found Maggie at Samuel's grave. "I'm staying," he said quietly, "if you'll have me." She turned, meeting his storm-gray eyes. "The Morrison gang won't be welcome in Copper Ridge. Then we'll build something new here, something worth defending." Sheriff Caldwell never returned. Word spread that the Morrison brothers had surrounded his office, forcing him to flee in the night. The corrupt lawman disappeared into history, leaving behind only whispered legends. Years later, the Blackthorn Morrison Ranch became a sanctuary for those seeking second chances. Maggie had opened her door to a dying outlaw and found not just love, but a new kind of family forged in desert steel and unshakable loyalty. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.